Honourable member for Brampton West.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've been here this morning and I've listened to the debate on the motions being brought forward by the members from the NDP. And I have to say, I'm surprised that the members of the NDP are trying to delete the important accountability clauses that are contained within this piece of legislation. But I'm not, of course, surprised that the Liberal Party, they go further. They want to delete every single clause in the bill. Of course, accountability and the Liberal Party generally don't go hand in hand. Well, Mr. Speaker, when I went to law school, we were told the old joke, you might have heard it, it's about if you have the law on your side, argue the law. If you have the facts on your side, argue the facts. If you don't have the facts and you don't have the law, bang your hand on the table and shout louder. And that's what we're hearing from both of the opposition parties today. They don't have the law on their side. They don't have the facts on their side. So what do? They bang their fists on the desk and argue about process. That's what they're left with, process. They're going to say there wasn't enough consultation. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not true. They know it's not true. In fact, the great member from Saskatoon, Rosetown, Bigger, Bill C-575, she had extensive consultation on that. In fact, it was through the consultation with First Nations that she brought forward the first incarnation of this legislation on financial transparency. There's been extensive consultation on this piece of legislation. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, it's First Nations themselves that want this to happen. I sat in committee and I heard the stories from members of our First Nations who said, I've asked for this information, it's not been produced, I've been subject to intimidation, I've been subject to threats just for asking for this information. Mr. Speaker, that's not acceptable. And by deleting Clause 11, which is one of the proposals by the NDP, we are going to remove a very significant piece of accountability that's in this legislation. Section 11 says, if a First Nation fails to publish any document under Section 8, any person, including the minister, may apply to the Superior Court for an order requiring the Council to carry out the duties under that section within the period specified by the court. Mr. Speaker, how can anyone be opposed to that? It's an accountability mechanism that's going to be there for First Nations in order to compel their council to produce information. Mr. Speaker, how is somebody against that? If a council is not publishing the salaries and remuneration of chiefs and council, and there's a mechanism here that's going to help them get that information, how can people on this side of the House, other than this small little corner here, how can they stand up and say, we're against that? Mr. Speaker, I do not understand. The purpose of this clause is to ensure that anyone can require a First Nation to publish this information. Mr. Speaker, it provides an avenue of redress for First Nations. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that we also heard many First Nations have made complaints directly to the minister. And when you hear what the opposition parties are saying, they're saying that's a perfect system. Let them just make the complaint to the minister and have the minister answer that question. That is not about transparency. That is not about accountability. The accountability has to come from the First Nation themselves. And Mr. Speaker, lots do it. I don't want to be accused of standing up here and saying that our First Nations communities, none of them provide this information. That's not true. Many of them do a fantastic job of providing this information to their members and being accountable to their members for the money that's spent. That's not what this legislation is designed to get at. There are some members, some communities that are not providing this information, and that is what this legislation is targeted at. Mr. Speaker, First Nation residents deserve and expect transparency and accountability from their elected representatives when it comes to these issues. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in December of 2010, the Assembly of First Nations passed a resolution at their Special Chiefs Assembly, affirming the need to publicly disclose salaries and expenses to their members. They also agreed to make this financial information available on the internet where applicable. Well, Mr. Speaker, nearly 2 years later, just over half of the more than 600 First Nations have a website. And Mr. Speaker, though, of those that have a website, less than 20 had posted their salary and remuneration on that website and on the internet. Mr. Speaker, this proves in of itself that voluntary compliance is not the answer. And we also know that complaining to the minister is not the answer. We want to give the power back to First Nations community members themselves to get this information so they don't have to go down those roads. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-27, the First Nations Transparency Act, Financial Transparency Act, will guarantee that all First Nation members will be able to hold their elected governments to account. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the informal requests from the minister, from members to the minister, just to get the information, the department also receives formal complaints regarding the potential mismanagement or misappropriation of banned funds and remuneration of officials. This legislation will ensure that this information is easily accessible to everyone, and it will remove the minister from the equation in many of these cases. And Mr. Speaker, what that's going to do is that is going to promote the direct lines of communication and accountability of First Nation leaders to its members, because we're taking the minister out of the equation. It shouldn't be a triangular approach. It shouldn't be the First Nation member has to complain to the minister's office, and then the minister's office goes down and says to the First Nation, produce this, and then the First Nation moves it across to the member. It should be a direct approach going from the member directly to the band council. And Mr. Speaker, I want to make this clear as well. This is not to suggest that First Nations are mismanaging their finances or are not accountable to their members, because in many cases, there are many examples of First Nations who are doing exactly that. Mr. Speaker, with the greater transparency that's being offered here, many of the complaints to the minister actually will not continue because they'll have the information that's necessary. And Mr. Speaker, when I listen to the member from, the member from Nanaimo Cowichan, she was suggesting that producing a financial statement is not the answer because it's not going to say how many houses were built or what the progress was made on the school. That's true, the financial statement is not going to say that. But imagine trying to understand what's going on with the finances in your community if you don't even have the financial statement, if you don't even have the salary, remuneration, and benefits of the chief and council. It's a logical first step. Once you have the financial statement, once you know the remuneration, you can start to say, well, wait a minute, where did all this money go? We received all this revenue. Why didn't we have houses built? So for them to suggest that somehow this isn't an answer is absolutely false. It's the first logical step towards putting the power back into the hands of the people. And that's what good accountable government is all about. We have that kind of accountability on the federal level. Our public finances are absolutely disclosed. Individuals could make all kinds of requests for information. That's not what is happening on our First Nations. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand today in support of this legislation, not only because it's a good piece of legislation, because I personally heard at committee the stories of community members saying enough is enough. We need help. We need this problem solved. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaires? The honourable member for Davenport.
With a lot of interest to my colleague's dissertation on accountability, on public accountability, I wonder if the parliamentary budget officer was listening to his comments on the open accessibility and the open transparency of his own government, whether he might have choked on his ham and cheese sandwich if that's what he's eating for lunch today. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask my honourable colleague if he can really truly stand up in this House and claim that this government is a model of accountability and accessibility, and further to that, how can he and his government hector and cajole other organizations that are trying to do their own due diligence and have already in place adequate and thorough transparency and accountability methods.
The honourable member for Brampton West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps my colleague didn't hear me at the start when I said if you don't have the law on your side, if you have the law on your side, argue the law. If you have the facts on your side, argue the facts. If you don't, bang your fist on the table and shout. Well, Mr. Speaker, he can't even ask a question. He can't even ask a question on the piece of legislation before us. He's abandoned all hope of opposing it because he knows it's the right thing to do. What does he talk about? Some vague reference to non-accountability. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, your salary's posted, it's public, it's disclosed, so is mine. That's not what's happening on every First Nation. And if you'd taken the time to look at the piece of legislation before you ask the question, you'd know that's what it's about. The financial transparency is not happening, and that's why we're putting this piece of legislation forward.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of State for Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to the member closely, and I certainly appreciate his point of view. I wonder if he could take a moment to elaborate. We had the member from the Liberal Party talk about the Kelowna Accord, which actually I've never seen a copy of that. I don't know if that actually even exists. They never put it in the budget, and it shows really a disrespect to First Nations that they raise that. And also, I wonder, with transparency comes accountability, and with accountability comes better use of taxpayers' money, which is really what is funding most of what we're talking about. So I wonder if you could talk about accountability and taxpayers' money as long as it flows to First Nations.
The honourable member for Brampton West.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for the question. It's a good question. The amazing thing that I've experienced being here for only a little over a year and a half is how the Liberal Party seems to have all the answers now that they're not the government. Everything that they could have fixed everything if they'd only had 1 or 2 more years. All these great ideas, or another month. That's all they needed in order to solve all the nation's problems. It's amazing. 13 years they couldn't do these things, but suddenly they've got the answer to all that. But my colleague makes the very important point. Transparency leads to good government. And a fundamental part of transparency for First Nation members is understanding what the financial situation is of their community. Mr. Speaker, think about it. How do you know how your government's doing if you don't know how any of the money is being spent? We have that accountability here in Ottawa. We have the parliamentary budget officer. We release a budget. We study the estimates in every department. This leads to good government. That's what we're looking for our First Nations communities. We want that good level of transparency so they can deliver good government. And if they aren't delivering good government, the people are now going to know. They're going to have the wherewithal to understand the financial status of their community and say, maybe we need to make a change. This isn't being run properly. That's exactly what this legislation is for.
Quick question. The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
20 seconds.
Wondering if the member realizes that there's already policies in place that require First Nations that must submit to the AANDC annual audited consolidated financial statements for public funds provided to them. These include salaries, honoraria, and travel expenses for all elected, appointed, and senior unelected band officials. The latter includes unelected positions such as those of the Executive Director and Band Manager, Senior Program Director, and Manager. First Nations are also required to release these statements to their membership. That seems pretty thorough to me.
The honourable member for Brampton West. We're out of time. Very quick answer.
Well, that's great. Another lob question. Mr. Speaker, if they're already doing all of this, then their number one argument that this is such a burden has now evaporated. So number 2, why don't they post it? That's what this legislation does. Deliver it to their members, not just to AANDC.